were enslaved in camps, experienced starvation, and were separated from family without even being able to say goodbye. Yet they emerged from the horrors of Europe, defied annihilation, and created new lives and communities. I am here to tell my parents, yes?
I'm sorry, something went slightly wrong at the beginning. Can you just give your name and intro again? I apologize.
The whole intro?
Yeah, I'm so sorry.
Okay,
It
so
jumped funny.
should I stop sharing?
Yes, go ahead and stop sharing and then we'll just do your intro real quick again.
Okay, all right.
Go right ahead.
All right. Thank you for tuning into Facebook Live to hear my family story. My name is Pearl Kagan, and it is my honor and privilege to be speaking to you today. I am part of the Generation to Generation program at the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center. I will be sharing my parents' story in loving memory of Anne and Jack Weinberg. I am the only child of 2 Holocaust survivors. My parents and all the survivors are truly the heroes of humanity. They witnessed and endured the worst of inhumanity, but found somehow in the depths of their own humanity the courage to go on. They lived through so much in their youth. They were ruthlessly persecuted, spent years in hiding or enslaved in camps, experienced starvation, and were separated from family without even being able to say goodbye. Yet they emerged from the horrors of Europe, defied annihilation, and created new lives and communities. I am here to tell my parents' story, for they can no longer. My parents' story is a lesson in courage, strength, bravery, sacrifice, resilience, and the ability to survive against all odds and unbelievable evil. With each year that passes, we move closer to a world without survivors and eyewitnesses, the people that are best able to tell these stories. So I feel that it is my responsibility to help ensure that their experiences are not forgotten, that the Holocaust is remembered, and its lessons are taught. It is a challenging goal as we face the reality that the Holocaust is frequently denied, distorted, or manipulated. We must keep the Holocaust as relevant in the next century as it was in the last. My parents spoke very little to me of the Holocaust and their experiences. All I knew was that they both lived through World War II and the Nazi reign of terror in Eastern Europe. Like many survivors of the Holocaust, they barely spoke of this horrific time in their past. As I was growing up in Chicago, the only family history I was told was that most of my parents' families, their parents, and many of their siblings were murdered by the Nazis. Although unsaid, it was clear to me that this dark part of my parents' lives were off limits, far too painful to talk about. Occasionally, I would hear a partial story, a snippet, but never the whole thing from beginning to end. About 10 years before my dad died, the Chicago Jewish Historical Society interviewed him and other survivors from his hometown in Poland about their lives before, during, and after the Holocaust. By watching this video testimony, obtaining information and documents from the International Tracing Service, and visiting Poland, I was able to piece together some of their story. Heroes. I'm just, okay. Here. Just click. Okay, sorry.
In 1916, I came to the United States in 1948, March 1948. So is my wife and my discussion. Sam?
So there was my dad, his opening remarks in his interview, explaining when he came to this country and where he was from. And these are 2 documents I received from the International Tracing Service. The top one is my mom's path of where she was during the Holocaust, because as we know, the Nazis kept meticulous records of where everybody was and where they were. So we can see here in my mom's, the top card, that she was born in Staszow in 1980. She was then in the Ghetto of Staszow. She went from the Ghetto when it was liquidated to Plaszow, to Auschwitz, then to Bergen Belsen, and then she was liberated. And then I will talk more about my mom's actual story later on in my presentation. And if we look at the card on the bottom, it talks about my dad's path. He also was from Staszow and was in the ghetto with Staszow. And then he was in 2 different labor camps. Then he was transferred to Bergen Belsen, and then he was liberated from Bergen Belsen. So my parents were both from Staszow, Poland, a shtetl 75 miles northeast of Krakow. Shtetls were small towns with large Jewish populations that existed in Central and Eastern Europe before the Holocaust. My parents were not married to each other before the war, although both of them were married to others, and my mother had a daughter. I did not learn about the existence of the sister I never knew until I was 11 or 12 and found my birth certificate that had a box checked for other children born alive but now deceased. Even when I asked my mom about it, I wasn't really told of anything of significance. This is a picture, and this is the only picture I have from any relatives from before the war. This is a picture of my mom's parents. So it's my maternal grandmother and my grandfather, Benjamin and Pearl Weinberg, and I was named after my grandmother. And here are some pictures of what Staszow looked like before the war. Every town in Europe had something called a Yortzeit book, and I was able to extract some of these pictures from that book just to give you an idea of what life was like in pre-war Staszow. Both of my parents came from fairly well-to-do families. Well, whatever well-to-do means, living in a shtetl. My dad's family owned a tanning factory where they manufactured the top parts of shoes, and my mom's family owned a water soda factory. Before the war, the population of Staszow was approximately 10,000, of which half were Jews who lived in the center of the town, while 5,000 Poles lived on the outskirts of the town. During the Holocaust, the number of Jews increased significantly due to resettlements. Staszow had an active, vibrant Jewish community. Jews were involved in politics, and there were democratic elections. There were public schools, a yeshiva, which is a Jewish school focusing on religious texts, a Mizrahi Hebrew school that most of the Jewish youth attended, and the 500 to 600-year-old Beit Knesset, which was the main synagogue. The Kehillah, which was the Jewish legal body, which was recognized by the Polish government, had the right to govern Jewish life, the synagogue, schools, the cemetery, and were able to assess and collect taxes. But the Jews and Poles lived almost as separate communities, and their only interaction was in commerce. There were clashes every day between the Jews and the Poles. The Jewish population in Staszow was entirely different than the Polish population. Jews spoke Yiddish, which is a hybrid between Hebrew and German, and the language of the Jews in Central and Eastern Europe. They dressed differently. They were Orthodox, which is the most observant movement in Judaism, and they wore payas, which were the long curly sideburns worn by men and boys in Orthodox Judaism. But Staszow was a mirror of Eastern Jewry as a whole. When you walked in the streets, you could hear children studying in the school, people praying in the synagogue, and heard songs of the Zionist movement, a movement that supported the creation of a Jewish homeland in the land of Israel. So here is a map, and I can go back and forth between the 2 pages and point out some points. So the map here is actually from the Yortzeit book that I talked about. And later on in my presentation, I will talk about my trip to Poland. So I was able to take these maps with me and with the tour guide, help find some of the spots that were in main significance of my trip. So we can see here that the plaque on the bottom with the arrow leading up is where the synagogue once stood. And there's a plaque that says on this site stood a synagogue where 6,000 Jews once worshiped. Here is another part of the map where we can actually see the picture of my father's family's, well, now it's an auto shop in Poland, but this is the site where my father's family business was. The bottom site where you have the green fence was actually the cemetery, which really doesn't exist there anymore. And in the top over here in the back, the green building is where my grandparents, my mother's family's water soda factory was. But all of that changed on September 1st, 1939, when Germany invaded Poland. At the time, my dad was 24 and my mom was 21. Their youth, strength, health, and ability to work would help them survive in the years to come. The relationship of Jews and Poles did not change much after Hitler came to power. There was always anti-Semitism in Poland. There were boycotts of Jewish businesses and picket lines with signs that said not to buy from Jews or not to associate with Jews. The same sentiments were reflected in the treatment of Jews in higher education. Jews were not allowed to sit in the lecture halls of universities, and they had to stand in the back of the room. The Jews in Staszow were appalled by the lack of aid they received from their neighbors. Poles usurped Jewish property, turned in Jews, and Jewish partisans were attacked and killed by Poles. After the German occupation, no one expected what really was to happen in the coming years. Everybody thought that there would be skirmishes that would blow over, but the Nazis deceived everyone that their final aim was to get rid of all the Jews. My dad felt that even though the Poles were unhappy with occupation, they were happy that the Nazis were taking care of the Jewish problem. The Jews in Staszow knew about Hitler, his rise to power, and what was going on through radio and newspapers. They were aware that before Kristallnacht, Polish Jews living in Germany were deported to Poland, and that Poland wouldn't let them in, and they were kept in a little town on the border. The Zionist group Shomer HaTzair was monitoring what was happening to Jews and warned that Jews were being slaughtered and were being taken to concentration camps. The president of Warsaw came to Staszow and warned that people who were deported were being straight sent to gas chambers, crematoriums. My cousin once asked my uncle, "Daddy, why didn't you leave? You knew what was happening and your family had money." My uncle replied, "You think it's that easy? Look at your life. You're living in Highland Park. You own a home, you have a job, you have a family and children. Now imagine that your parents are living a block away. They're older and they need your help. Your brother and his family live down the street, and your sister and her family live on a different block, but all close by. Not everyone can get out. How do you decide who goes and who to leave behind? And where would you even go?" So the decision is made that everyone stays together. The Jews had choices. When they heard about the killing vans and how carbon monoxide was being used to murder the Jews, both my parents' families tried to go into hiding. They built bunkers underground their businesses to hide in. The Poles who took over my dad's family abandoned tanning factory, turned in my grandparents, and they were sent to Treblinka in the gas chambers. On my mother's side, a Polish policeman who had been a friend of the family for years tricked my grandmother into coming up from the bunker, and a Nazi policeman shot her in front of my mom. The feeling of many survivors from my parents' hometown was that the Poles did more harm to them than the Nazis. On July 1st, 1940, all Jews over the age of 15 were required to work at forced labor camps, building roads 2 days a week. On January 1st, 1942, Jews were ordered not to leave town upon penalty of death. And on January 15th, all the Jewish businesses were placed under control of the Nazis. And in the summer of 1942, the ghetto was established. The Jews of Staszow that had lived in 60% of the town were now concentrated in 2 streets. There were severe restrictions. Jews had to wear the yellow stars. There was hardly any food and water, and the conditions were horrible. So here you can see a picture, again from the Yortzeit Memorial Book of my parents' hometown, of the Jews and people wearing stars. The Nazis liquidated the ghetto on November 8, 1942, which was referred to as Black Sunday.
When they liquidated Staszow, how did they liquidate Staszow? It's very important. You know, they came in at night, was November the 9th, October night, the whole town was cleaned out to the marketplace. In the marketplace. And they allowed, in order to spread fear, they kept on killing right on the spot, shooting right on the spot. The streets were laid out with dead people. And then the rest, they were driving out to by horse and buggy or by foot to a nearby train to take into concentration camp, which was built in Lincoln, where they liquidated the whole Staszow.
Despite almost everyone being taken to the nearby train station and sent to concentration and death camps where they were murdered, my father was able to escape and save my cousin Diane, who was 5 at the time, by smuggling her away in a pillowcase. Later in life, my father would reminisce every time he saw Diane how she kept asking him, "Uncle, why are you pinching me?" as he tried to keep her quiet. And here is 2 pictures of my dad and my cousin Diane. The one on the left, the top left, you can see a smaller picture of my dad. He's wearing a little black furry hat and he's holding a little blonde girl and you can't see her face as they were boarding the train. And then in the bottom right is a bigger picture, the same, of my dad holding my cousin Diane. After liquidation, my parents' paths were very different and they did not meet again till almost the end of the war. My dad was sent first to Staszow labor camp where they manufactured munitions. He was there until July of 1944. He used to tell my son how they tried to smuggle bullets out of the factory and drop them in the forest for the partisans to find. He was then transferred to the Staszow labor camp, which was a foundry camp making metal casings. In January of 1945, he was transported to Bergen Belsen, where he was reunited with his older brother Don, and they were liberated in April of 1945. After liquidation, my mom was sent to Plaszow labor camp for 2 years. This camp was notorious for horrible terror. The commander was sadistic in his treatment and killing of prisoners. Witnesses say he would never start his breakfast without shooting at least one person. The camp was a slave labor camp supplying manpower to several armament factories and a stone quarry. The death rate was very high and the camp was infamous for both individual and mass shootings. Many prisoners, including many women and children, died of typhus, starvation, and executions. In September 1944, my mom was transported to Auschwitz in a boxcar. The travel conditions were horrific. 100 to 150 people crammed into the car, doors locked with very little air, no sanitation facilities, heat or air conditioning, and no food or water. Many people died in the atrocious conditions of the transit. This is not the actual boxcar that my mom was in, but this is a picture of a boxcar. In January 1945, as the Russians advanced, Auschwitz and other death camps were evacuated. My mom and the other prisoners were marched to Bergen Belsen in the West. The Nazis did not want to leave any witnesses or survivors or any evidence of their crimes. These prisoners, who had endured so much in ghettos, labor camps, and death camps, were now being forced to march long distances in the bitter cold with little or no food, water, or rest. Those who could not keep up were shot. At Bergen Belsen, my mom found her younger sister Frances, and they were liberated in April of 1945. I will speak a little later about my personal trip to Poland, but these are some of the pictures I took when I did travel and visited the camps. So this is the entrance to Auschwitz that says in German, Arbeit macht frei, which means work will set you free. So even until the very end, when the Nazis were taking all of these prisoners into the camp with the intent of murdering most of them, they still tried to deceive everybody as they entered the camp that they were going to be there for work purposes. These are what the barracks looked like in Auschwitz. As you can see, they're wooden barracks, there's spaces in the slats, very poorly constructed. These are the train tracks. It's a very famous picture of the train leading into the second part of Auschwitz that was built later in the war, Birkenau, which was really built primarily for the destruction and the murder of the Hungarian Jews. Plaszow no longer exists, the labor camp where my mom was. That has been destroyed, but there's a stone memorial memorializing Plaszow and the Jews that were murdered there. This is a stone with my parents' town Staszow on it, and these are part of all the stones that are now on the site where Treblinka was. Again, Treblinka was also destroyed by the Nazis in order to eliminate the evidence, but all the stones that are erected are the names of the towns where people were transported to Treblinka and then they were murdered. And this is another document that I received from the International Tracing Service, and in red on the top lists my mom's name, the date of her birth, where she was from, and that she was on the survivor list from Bergen Belsen and was liberated from Bergen Belsen. My dad returned to Staszow in 1945, trying to go home.
Skip a little bit there again. I came back to Poland in 1945 in the beginning. I'm one of the first Jews in Poland. And he came in, he did trying to come back to the cities. They thought maybe a sprinkle of life to come back. The only one thing which they asked you, how come you live? You came back to a city which you lived 1,000 years. This is our history over there. I'm 1,000 years old. And of course, nobody asked you, do you need a coffee? Do you need a hot meal? The only one question which they ask is, how come you still alive? How come you're still alive and why did they come back? Why did they come back? Why did they ask that question? Because they were afraid that their dream might be spoiled. Because they were already sitting in my father's house. They were sitting already in somebody else's house, and they are afraid this will be taken away from them. So they did everything physically possible to kill the Jews. In fact, they started with any killing this because they were lucky. It was over there a Russian, a lot of Russian Jewish officers, and when he came back, they said, go, don't stay overnight, don't kill you.
Before leaving, my dad was able to retrieve some valuables that he and his family had hidden in a tree trunk. Included were my grandmother's wedding and engagement rings that my father wore every day of his life. I was married using my grandmother's wedding band, as were both my son David and my daughter Leslie. And I hope you can see in the little box that I'm at, this is my grandmother's wedding ring. It's really the only article I have from anything before the war. My mom also returned to Staszow with her first husband who had survived the war. They went back home trying to find their daughter that they had given to neighbors to hide. The little girl was never found, and my mother's husband was shot and murdered while walking on the streets of Staszow. These are some of the pictures I have that were taken post-war. So in the corner is my parents and my Auntie Frances, my mom's younger sister. So it's my dad in there. And then the middle picture is again my mother, her first husband, and my aunt. And then the second picture also was with my mom and her first husband as they were walking through the streets. Both of my parents realized that they could not stay in Poland and that there would never be a Jewish life for them there again. They ended up in a DP camp in Stuttgart, and survivors from my parents' hometown erected a memorial on the site of the Hessenthal concentration camp. So here's one picture of the memorial, and on the top, I'm sorry, I don't know everybody in the picture, but on the top in the middle is my Auntie Frances, my mom's younger sister, and on the bottom, on the right is my dad, and on the left is his older brother, my Uncle Don. And here's the second picture of the memorial, and again, on the top is my dad, my Auntie Faye, my mom, my Uncle Don, and my mom's baby sister, Auntie Frances. My parents immigrated to America on the SS Marine Jumper in March of 1948, along with my dad's brother, his wife, and my mom's sister. My parents were married in 1952, and I was born in 1954, when my dad was 39 and my mom 36, or at least that's the ages we think they were. My parents had several birthdays, and my dad had talked about making themselves older when they arrived in this country to avoid being drafted to the army. We always celebrated my dad's birthday on the second day of Hanukkah, but we were really never sure of the actual date or year. After my Auntie Frances, my mom's younger sister, died, my cousin from Toronto called me right before the unveiling of her stone. She was so worried that when they removed the covering to the stone, somebody would yell out from the back that they had the wrong birthday. I was named after my mom's mother, Pearl, and my dad's mother, Sarah. Even though for my entire life, I have always been called Pearl, my parents were afraid to give me such a Jewish sounding name. And legally I'm named Patricia, but I'm not really sure who they thought they were kidding since my maiden name is Weinberg. But my parents felt that they rose from the Shoah, from the ashes of the Shoah, with a solemn obligation to continue Jewish life. They gathered the remnants of their vitality and the remaining sparks of their humanity and turned to rebuilding their lives and communities, but forever under the shadow of those absent. My parents taught me that it is up to all of us to remember, to educate, and to help ensure that never again remains more than a mere slogan.
I want you to know that the survivors, the witnesses of that Jewish tragedy, in another few years will be gone. Historians write whatever they want to. And it's going to be your obligation to tell from generation to generation what that tragedy was, that you are not only me, that you are the survivor. In fact, we all are the survivor.
This is why I traveled to Poland with March of the Living, a Holocaust education program where 8,000 Jewish teens and 120 adult delegation from around the world explored the remnants of the Holocaust. We spent our week in Poland traveling around the country, not only learning about the Holocaust, but also discovering a lost world rich in Jewish heritage, which no longer exists. We visited many of the key places where the Holocaust events took place in order to understand the world that was destroyed. On Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day, we marched the 3 kilometers from Auschwitz to Birkenau, the largest concentration camp complex built by the Nazis, in the footsteps of the 6 million who perished, to show the world that the Jewish nation will endure regardless. I was able to trace my roots, visit my parents' hometown, see the ghettos, and walk through the concentration camps where most of my family was murdered. At Auschwitz, I found my 17-year-old cousin from Canada, who was also on the march with the Toronto delegation. What a moment. Me, the child of survivors, and he, the grandchild of survivors, together, proving that Hitler did not succeed. But despite being the child of survivors, growing up with the after effects of the Holocaust and studying to become a docent at this museum, I was unprepared for what I saw and what I experienced. I still cannot wrap my arms around the enormity of what I saw and the enormity of what happened. Majdanek and Auschwitz are 667 acres and over 800 acres respectively. These camps operated 24/7, almost on top of surrounding towns, with gas chambers and crematoriums in constant use. How could people not have known what was going on? How could the world have let this happen? I can tell you that I honestly do not know how anyone survived. The day we spent in Auschwitz was cold, rainy, and raw. We were all dressed in fleeces, coats, boots, hats, gloves, scarves, and we were freezing and miserable. How did my mom make it out of there? Visiting my parents' hometown was depressing. Not a trace of Jewish life remains, and the happy life my parents once knew is forever gone. No synagogue, no Jewish school, no cemetery, not even one mezuzah. The plaque where the synagogue once stood says, "On this site, 6,000 Jews worshipped." Where is the plaque that should read, "In memory of the 6,000 murdered"? I am in the first of my family to go to Poland. I lit the York site, the memorial candles, and said Kaddish, the mourner's prayers, for my mother's family in Staszow, where they were murdered, and for my father's family in Treblinka, where they were murdered. For that, I know my parents would be happy, but they were never willing to go back. They said it would be too painful. In their eyes, Poland was the ground for all the death camps, and that the final annihilation of European Jewry took place predominantly on Polish soil. But somehow my parents went on. I don't think I ever heard them say, "I cannot do that." They developed such strength because it took so much to start again over and over. My mom lost her parents and 3 siblings, but some survived. Her younger sister Frances came to Chicago with my parents and soon moved to Toronto. We don't really know why Toronto. What my cousins and I can only guess is that someone said to her, "Come to Toronto, we have a boy for you." My aunt had 3 children and 8 grandchildren. My mom's older brother made Aliyah, immigration to Israel before the war, and lived in Haifa. Her younger brother survived the death camps in Europe, tried to immigrate to Israel, but was placed in a British internment camp in Cyprus before finally being allowed to enter Israel. My dad lost his parents and several siblings, but he too had family that survived. His younger sister Anne, her husband Hillary, and their daughter Diane, whom my father saved, immigrated to Toronto. Diane had 3 children. My aunt and uncle had another daughter who had 2 children. My dad's older brother Don survived, married in Stuttgart, came to Chicago with my parents, and had 1 daughter. She lives in Highland Park, and we are very close. We only have each other. We are all that's left of our families. I know that to my parents, I was a miracle, and that my children, Leslie and David, were even greater miracles. They never thought they would have families again. At my daughter's bat mitzvah, my dad talked about the different names we are called throughout our lives. First by the name your parents give you, then by the names your friends call you. And if you're lucky, one day somebody calls you daddy. And if you are really lucky, one day you're called the sweetest name of all, Zadie, which is grandfather in Yiddish. I am truly blessed to have 5 grandchildren, and I only wish that my family and my parents were alive to see how our family has grown and flourished. My parents' families and traditions live on through us. We are forever enriched by what they taught us and by how they lived their lives. I'd like to end my presentation with my dad's closing remark in his interview with the Chicago Jewish Historical Society.
He's been selected by the other people who participated in our discussion today to make a concluding statement. Mr. Weinberg? I'll make it very short. First of all, it was a very interesting evening, afternoon. The story of Staszow, the story of the Holocaust was told. We didn't have the witnesses. And I think if the old oceans were ink, there wouldn't be enough ink to tell the story of our tragedy.
Thank you for tuning in. Join us next Wednesday, November 4th at 10 a.m. to hear Holocaust survivor Sharon Pitlick-Silver share her story of survival. Please keep an eye on the Illinois Holocaust Museum's Facebook and other social media accounts, where we will post a stream of content through the weeks ahead. Thank you all for your support during these extraordinary times, and a personal thank you from me for listening to my story and my family's story. It's been an honor and a privilege to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Pearl. Do you want to answer a couple questions today?
I sure do.
Okay. I've got a few right now. When did your parents first start to tell you their story?
My parents really never spoke to me about the Holocaust. My mom never spoke about it. I think the fact that my mom had a family and had a child that was murdered and saw her mom being murdered in front of her, and also had her husband murdered after he survived the war, really was very difficult for her. And so she was really what I would call a more damaged survivor. My father really didn't speak a lot about it, but when my son was getting ready to write all of his essays for applications to colleges, he interviewed my dad, and that's when my dad really started talking about the stories, and we learned more about it. I really learned a tremendous amount about my parents' story from watching that video of my dad's interview, where I showed excerpts from, and also from a lot of the information I got from the United States Holocaust Museum's tracing service, but they didn't speak very much about it at all.
Wow. Why did you get involved with the museum?
You know, I got involved with the museum quite a while after my parents were gone. And I just felt that it was important for me to become more educated about the Holocaust, to learn about it and to be able to educate and to help teach other people about our tragedy and help them learn. There were so many lessons to be learned from the Holocaust about standing up and being an upstander and not sitting by and watching terrible things happen to other people. And these are lessons that we can carry forward into our lives today. And when I talk to the students, I try to explain to them that if they see things that are going on that are not right, even if they are afraid to say anything themselves, they need to go and find an adult, a teacher, to talk about it. I try to explain to them why somebody maybe would be a collaborator, why they would be a perpetrator, maybe why they would just be a bystander afraid to speak. So I just feel like I'm carrying on my parents' legacy and teaching about their stories.
And you're doing an amazing job. One last question. What is kind of the message or takeaway that you want people to have from hearing your parents' story?
As I started out, I really think the theme of my parents' story is resilience and strength and the ability to go on. I think that survivors have something in them. I have a girlfriend who always says to me, you have survivor genes, you're going to get through this. And a lot of it also was luck and how they were treated and where they were sent. But I think that the message here is that you can survive unbelievable evil and you can bounce back from terrible experiences. And we can always see, hopefully, the light at the end of the tunnel and know that no matter what happens to us, we can survive and we can rebuild and we can start lives and families all over again.
What a perfect message to end it on. That's all the questions we have. So thank you.
Okay, thank you again. It was really an honor to be able to speak. Oh, this is my daughter hugging me. This is my daughter, Leslie. Everybody, thank you guys again for listening to us. It was just an amazing honor and privilege to be able to do this. And I just want to part by saying that the museum is open and it is an amazing museum. And there was just so much there to go and to learn and to see. And I am so sad that students are not doing tours there right now. And I cannot wait for the doors to be open to schools and to students to come back so that we can take them through and teach them. But please, please go to the museum, visit, see the amazing exhibits. There is so much to learn there. And thank you again.